Breaking through the enemy position, quickly bringing in your pieces, placing killer knights on the board, key squares in the endgame, and relativity. We have so much to cover this week. Let's go. Starting with breaking through the enemy position. This comes from the book Attacking Chess for Club Players by Gruten. I have isolated 2 examples from the book. The focus now is on opening up the enemy king so that you can take advantage of its lack of defense to quickly then bring in your pieces so that you can attack and deliver checkmate. Sometimes this is going to happen at the expense of some of your pieces, so you're going to need to sacrifice. And I think this is a great example of that. In this position, right now, you cannot quite do that because your pieces are a bit in the way of one another, especially that knight on f5. And so the best thing that you can do is to actually sacrifice that knight by giving check to the king on e7. When queen takes, then you're going to go queen takes h7, sacrificing your queen as well. But now, after the king takes, your rook is free to move along the 5th rank and also to come in along the h file, which means now you can give another check on h5, taking advantage of the pin that the bishop exerts on the pawn on g6. And that allows you to give less check to the king before it goes to g8, and you can actually deliver checkmate, rook h8. So that was really interesting. I thought that was a great example of how sometimes your pieces can get in the way of one another and you can just get rid of one of them as long as you have a winning attack right after. However, it kind of leverages this idea that you need to have all your other pieces ready for the attack. And so I've taken another example from the book, which shows you just the power of bringing in your pieces very quickly. And it's this one. So once again, you need to kind of open up the enemy king and then use the remaining pieces on the board, coordinate them effectively to set up a mating net. And the best way to do this is to actually play rook takes f7. So you're going to sacrifice one of your 2 rooks, but now your pieces are very well placed to quickly deliver mate. One of the best sequences and defenses by black is when you go rook c7 to deliver the first check. Black can interpose the bishop, but after queen e4, black can try to defend the bishop, rook e8. That does nothing. Queen e6 check. The king goes back to f8. And now, key move, see if you can spot it, bishop e4, bringing in the last piece into the attack. And there's really nothing left for black to do. Let's say rook b7, just sort of getting in the way. Bishop takes g6. The king moves because otherwise we just give mate on f7. And queen still goes to f7, gives the check, king h6, queen h7 check, and we just kind of start hunting around the king, f4 check, king g4, queen takes h5, checkmate. And this was kind of the best defense by black because you had to see that move with the bishop to bring in that last piece. The other ones, if black doesn't put the bishop in between, after queen e4, you're going to deliver mate very, very quickly. And next up is improve your chess pattern recognition. So this week I went over a chapter about killer knights, which are basically knights placed on f5 or f4, which I think is really fitting with what we just seen because it all revolves around the idea of, like I said, getting this knight to this key square, but then you're going to use that to launch a crazy attack on the enemy king, sometimes even sacrificing your knight so that you can open up the position. I think these 2 games are great examples of that. I'm quickly going to run through the moves of the first one. So here, white has this idea of placing the knight on f5, and so you're going to see how it starts moving its pieces in such a way so as to achieve that. And then once it does that, right here, knight f5, at this point, it's all about bringing in the pieces into the attack. And I particularly like this moment when white plays queen d2, which moves the queen back by 1 square just so that it can quickly bring it into black's position. So after queen d2, the coordination of the white player's pieces massively improves. You have bishop f8 by black, queen g5 coming in, giving a check, king f7, and now rook f1, bringing in the rook as well, king e6, black starts to run away, but there's nothing black can do because now comes knight g7, attacking the black king. And this is what I was talking about when I said that sometimes you're gonna sacrifice that knight to launch a winning attack, because at this point it can go 2 ways. Black can either take the knight or can just kind of move the king and keep running away. If black takes the knight, this is actually a forced mate. So after the bishop takes, queen takes, let's say rook f8, queen takes the rook as well, king d7, rook comes in, taking d6, queen f2, rook takes f2 as well. Black just gives up all the material. That's what Stockfish tries to do to preserve the position as much as it can, but nothing will work. King c7, knight a4, closing that b6 square so that the king has no way to run away. c5, trying to create another square, but nothing works. Rook f7 check, king c6, queen c8, and that's mate. There is nothing left for black to try. Sacrificed everything, tried to push the pawn to open up the position, nothing works. The other option is what happens if black black doesn't take the knight, it doesn't really change much because after king d7, you're gonna give one more check. And now you have knight e6, which ends the game on the spot. You have this crazy fork on king, rook, and queen, which is just game over for black. So it's interesting how in both cases, it's irrelevant what black does to defend. You have a very strong attack and you can leverage that to get the win. There is, however, one more example that I wanted to show from the book, and it's this one. It involves, again, a lot of sacrifices to open up the enemy king. There was some cooperation by black, but it doesn't really matter. Let's check it out. White just played knight g3 with the idea of going knight f5. Black mobilizes the queen, queen c7, knight f5, so we get that quickly. Bishop f8, moving it away. Bishop g5. And this is the first interesting move to me because it doesn't just challenge the knight, threatening to ruin the pawn structure, but once the knight moves back, white just kind of leaves the bishop there, moves away the knight to open up the diagonal for the queen, and now black plays h6. So white successfully provoked that pawn forward and will be able to take advantage of that later on with a sacrifice to open up the position. So pulls back the bishop, king h7. This is what I mean by there was some cooperation by black, because the knight should have gone to e7, challenging our knight on f5, but whatever. King h7, queen f3, bringing in another piece, knight e7, but now it's too late. Bishop b3, setting up some stuff with the queen in case the knights get traded off. g6 by black, and at this point the sacrifices begin. Knight takes h6, bishop takes h6, queen takes f7 check, bishop g7, bishop h6, king takes h6, so white gives up the bishop as well, but now white is free to mobilize the rook. So rook e3, knight f6, rook h3, check, knight h5, stopping that, but now there's g4. And there's really nothing that black can do at this point. Bishop h8, knight f3, threatening another mate with the pawn. Bishop f6 to stop that, but queen takes. And now the queen is pinning the g6 pawn to the king. So that pawn is ineffective at defending the knight. And we have king h7 trying to run away, but the knight quickly comes in with another check. And again, there's a mate threat. The king has to come back, but even at this point, because of the pin, white can simply play rook takes h5, checkmate. So it was very interesting to me how you have to first work for this positional advantage, only to then give it all up to deliver this strong attack against your opponent. But now let's go back to the basics for a moment before jumping back into some more interesting and advanced examples. I have continued to go over the first chapter of 100 Endgames You Must Know, another really cool book. And this time the focus was more on like key squares and very basic king and pawn endgames. If your pawn is on the 5th rank, then your key squares are sort of the 3 right in front of it. And as long as your king is right there, you're going to be able to win the game by gaining the opposition. So in this case, for example, you just go here, the black king is forced to move, you go forward and manage to get in. And at this point, again, there's nothing black can do because your pawn will just promote. But if your pawn is a little bit further back, in this case, these key squares are 1 row ahead. And so they're like these 3. And what you have to do is figure out a way to ensure that your king is going to end up on one of those 3 squares. And as long as you get to do that, you're going to win the game. And here white does it by playing king d5, immediately going from the pawn. Black can try to come in king e7, but white still has one of the 3 squares available, king c6, and now it's a win. There's nothing black can do. Even if black goes king e6, you just go d5, push the king back, and now you go king c7, and we're back in the same situation that we were before, where all the squares that lead to promotion are protected by the white king, and white will promote and win the game. There are 2 more examples which I thought were very interesting. One of them is how to hold a draw through distant opposition. So in this case, you have white alone with their king to face black, who also has a pawn. But as long as you know distant opposition, you can hold a draw. And distant opposition basically just means that you want your king and the enemy king to be separated by an odd number of squares. So in this case, you play king b1 so that there are 3 empty squares between you and the enemy king. And when they come forward, you go back to your usual opposition with king b2. And now you can just hold that, and you're going to go in front of the pawn, and you're going to take away all the key squares that we were mentioning in the previous examples. And after c3, you just go back. And at this point, there's nothing that black can do to promote. It's just going to be a stalemate. So I think that's very useful because a lot of times I, for example, knew a lot about the basic opposition, but not so much about how to deal with that when the other king is further away from your own. So this was a nice example of that. And the last one that I wanted to cover was this funny situation with the rook pawn. So the rook pawn is kind of like the worst pawn in these kinds of endgames if your king is close to that. Otherwise, if your king is not close to the corner, it's kind of like the best one that you can have because it's on the opposite side and the king won't be able to reach it. But if the enemy king or the defending king, let's say, is nearby, there is nothing you can do. I'm not really sure this is from this book. Maybe it was from the other book. Doesn't matter. King h1, and as long as white can keep that king in the corner, there is nothing that black can do. King f3 just drops the pawn immediately. King g4 going back to defend everything. King h1, and now king g3 trying to like limit the mobility of the white king, but white just goes king g1, and when the pawn comes down king h1, you're back in the corner, and as if black moves away, loses the pawn again, and then can start pushing forward, coming down with the king. They can push the whole thing forward, but it's just a repetition of what just happened. White will keep shuffling their king around in that corner of the board, and there's nothing that black can do, no matter how many rook pawns it has. So yeah, black is completely hopeless. It's going to be a draw. It doesn't really matter how much more material in terms of pawns you give the player on that file. There is nothing that the black can do to win. However, there are also some more advanced and interesting examples coming from this book, Chess Strategy for Club Players, about situations where one player has a lot more material and yet they still cannot win the game. So I wanted to show some of the positions that had the most instructive value to me. One that I enjoyed a lot was how to leverage the possibility of stalemates. It's this position, you're black, you're down a full piece, but you can actually draw the game if you play the right move. And the right move is to actually give up even that last pawn that you have by playing b6, because after white takes, you're gonna go king b7, and at this point it's gonna be very difficult for white to coordinate their pieces in such a way that the pawn can promote, because that bishop is trapped and you're gonna take advantage of that. So after white goes king b5, you just go king a8, and now there's nothing that the bishop can do. Bishop b8, we just lose the bishop, of course. But if white pushes the pawn onto b7, then the king just takes the bishop. King c6, and you go king b8, and you're back into one of those basic endgames that we were seeing before, where it's just a draw, king b6, and it's stalemate. And even if white tries something different after trading the pawn, it's not really gonna lead to anything. Like bishop b8, we just lose the bishop, so then the king can come forward, but you get the opposition. And again, it's just gonna be those basic patterns that we saw before. It's a draw. The other option is, instead of playing king b5, they just go king d6, or trying to go away. But in that case, you go king a8, you place your king in that corner, and when the king comes back to c6, it's a draw by stalemate again, because all the squares that your king could have moved to are now covered either by the white king or the white bishop, which is defended by the pawn. So once again, it's a draw achieved by giving up that one less piece of material that you had. And now for the last two positions, they're a bit of a test. I enjoyed thinking about this a lot. I think they show some traits of the pieces that we are all kind of aware of, but these are great examples to hammer those in. It's black to play in this position. You have pretty much two moves that you can really play with your king. One of them draws, one of them loses. Can you figure out which one is the right one? Pause the video, take some time to think about it. So king f8 is not the right answer, unfortunately, because the knight is just in time to cover the f7 square. Basically, what happens in this position is you're going to have to shuffle your king between f8 and f7 in order to keep the white king stuck in the corner and the white player unable to promote that h7 pawn. But as the knight comes closer in this position, you have no way to avoid this moment when the knight jumps to e5 and covers the f7 square. So now your king has to move out, and because of that, the white king can now go to g7 and the pawn will promote and white will win the game. So king f7 was the right move, and the reason for it, in the words of the book, is that knights don't triangulate. And what that means is that you cannot make a passing move with the knight that still allows you to cover the squares that it was covering on the previous move. This is different from, like, you know, when you're giving checkmate with a rook and a king and you just move your rook by one square and nothing really changes, but it's now the opponent's turn. The knight cannot do that. And you see this very well in this example, because now as the knight approaches the king, eventually it does get again to a square that allows it to cover f7, but now our king is already on f7, so it just moves to f8. It doesn't have to move away, and in this position there is no move that the knight can perform that will still cover f7, and so you're always going to be able to shift back and forth, and it's going to be a draw. And this is what I meant by, I think this example is amazing at showing some characteristics of the pieces that sometimes we overlook, but that are actually very important, and at least very interesting to know to me. And the last example showcases the importance of placing your rook behind the passed pawn, which is something that we all kind of do, but I thought this was a great way to show why it is so strong to have that coordination. Usually you want to promote your pawn to get a queen, but in this position, black has that queen, and yet at best, black can draw. You can pause to figure out what's the right move for black, but it's king c7. Black has to bring in the king, and white can only sort of shuffle the rook back and forth. Once the king is on d7 and it's black's turn again, black can go for a forcing sequence to trade off all the material, and that is accomplished by playing queen h5. At this point, you're targeting both the promotion square, so your queen is still eyeing e8, but it's also eyeing the rook. And what that means is that if white pushes the pawn, you're just gonna take the new queen, and when white captures back with the rook, you take back with the king, and it's a draw. The other option is, what happens if white just sort of keeps shuffling the rook, but in that case, you now have queen h4 check, and you're sort of forking, let's say, the king and the pawn, and when the king moves to e2, now you take the pawn first, and white has to recapture, and after that, you take back with the king, and once again, you end up in that drawn position of just king versus king. So those were the most interesting things that I went over this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, consider subscribing for more, and I'll be back next week with another video. I'll also leave you with one last position. Take a look at it. I am still working on it. Let me know in the comments if you know the solution. I'll see you next week. Bye bye.